So first of all, good morning. Hope everybody is well. Hope you had a nice Shabbos. Hope you had a nice Sunday. Hope everybody is top of the week, feeling good, feeling healthy, feeling strong. Our class this morning, our shir, Contemporary Cases in Shas, is generously sponsored by Mrs. Suzanne Hollander. Thank you, Suzanne, for sponsoring today's class in commemoration of the yahrzeit of her beloved husband, Howard Hollander, Avram Tzvi ben Menachem Mendel. His neshama should have an aliyah, and in the merit of us learning Torah together should be a zchus, a merit for the entire family. Okay. So continuing the conversation we began a few weeks ago in trying to understand the order of operations, the way things go. Zriza magdim mitzvos, tader v'shenu tader kodem. You have one day out to be able to perform a mitzvah. Which one has kadima? Which one has preference? Which one is preferred? So part of what is this conversation is putting ourselves into a situation where there's practice. So there's the theory and then there's practice. You can learn something in a graduate school and a graduate program, and then all of a sudden you have to then figure out how to put it into practice in a specific case, in a case study. So that's what we're going to do here this morning. And part of what we've learned till now is bringing us to this case here this morning that we're going to study. It's a sefer that we've learned before, sefer that I like to learn some of the cases Shabbos afternoon with some of the assembled members of our community. And this is an interesting case that really brings to the forefront the idea of how do you give preference to one mitzvah over another. Is there a statistic? Is there a variable? Is there an idea that then gives us and forces our hand to be able to then have a perspective as to one mitzvah that might be before another mitzvah, one attribute before another attribute? Again, these principles of zriza magdim mitzvos, you want to jump to with alacrity to do a mitzvah, or the idea, the notion of, again, tader v'shenu tader kodem, or when you have both of these ideas coming together in unified unison in ways for which they come together. Okay, now just let's start with this. Are there ever situations where we're able to push off a mitzvah? We learned in the tshuva and the response of the Radbaz, in the case of a prisoner who has the ability to come out, there's an opportunity for him then, as he says, is rizim magdim mitzvos, because it's if every mitzvah is important. So how would you ever choose one mitzvah over another? The first mitzvah, you have an opportunity to jump on that, so you should jump on that. Is there ever a situation where you're allowed al pi halacha to push off a mitzvah? Does that ever find itself that we are presented with such a challenge, with such an opportunity that we have to do that, or it's preferred to do that? Usually we say no, but actually it's interesting that there is one. And one of those cases that it's mentioned actually is in the response of the Trumas Adeshin. I didn't print the source of the Trumas Adeshin, but it's a famous Trumas Adeshin. The Trumas Adeshin says that what happens, for example, when is it that it's ideal for a person to say Kiddush Levana? So we say Kiddush Levana on the first Motzei Shabbos. Most people know that it's the first Motzei Shabbos after Rosh Chodesh. Now, it also depends on when that Motzei Shabbos is. If for example, if Shabbos is Rosh Chodesh, do you say Kiddush Levana that Motzei Shabbos? The answer is no. You wait until the following Motzei Shabbos. There has to be a minimum amount of days. Machlek is 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. But suffice it to say, there is a situation that there might be, because Shabbos was Rosh Chodesh and now it's Motzei Shabbos, even though it's preferred to do it on Motzei Shabbos, you might have a chance in a situation where you have to push it off. Now, why and when is that? So let's begin with this. Yeah, pikuach nefesh, obviously, sure. Pikuach nefesh, of course, is a situation where you push it off. But I'm talking about where it's not pikuach nefesh. When would you just stop, push off a mitzvah? So let's take the idea of the mitzvah of Kiddush Levana. So first of all, why do we say Kiddush Levana on a Motzei Shabbos? Right? The answer, of course, we know is that we want to say it in a certain a mood of merriment. There's something being malava malka, even though we say that the Alpi Kabbalah, that the neshama yisera leaves a person Motzei Shabbos, the extra soul, there's a certain sadness, a certain dwindled spirit that was kindled so aflame on Shabbos, and now it's diminished somewhat. But nonetheless, if I sit to say that that's true, there's still Motzei Shabbos, a spirit that's kindled. There's still malava malka. There's still a ruchnius, and therefore there's a spirit of simcha that you're still dressed in your Shabbos clothes. You just left Shabbos, and therefore we say, says the Mishnah Berurah, we say Kiddush Levana Motzei Shabbos because of that spirit. Now, what happens in a situation where you see a full moon on a Tuesday, Wednesday night, right? And you're not sure if that coming next Motzei Shabbos is going to be a cloudy night. So if you have the opportunity to say Kiddush Levana on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and it's a clear moon, and it's a clear opportunity to say after Rosh Chodesh, do you say it that night, or do you wait till Motzei Shabbos? It's a machlokes. The Trumas Adeshin says that what you do is you paskin, and this is what we do, is that we follow that we push it off till Motzei Shabbos. Why? Even though there exists a possibility that Motzei Shabbos will be cloudy and rainy. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, if you live in a rainy climate where there's a greater likelihood that that could be unable for you, and now you have this Pesach, this opening that allows you to be able to now say it, so you grab it. And there's some people that follow not like the Trumas Adeshin and actually say it in the middle of the week. But since it's ideal for a person to say it Motzei Shabbos, this is an unusual situation where nothing to do with Pikuach Nefesh. You have the opportunity to say it now on a Tuesday, Wednesday night, but because it's ideal to say it Motzei Shabbos, you wait. And even if that waiting would mean that you would miss the opportunity, that goes against very much what we've been saying. But the whole purpose of just even sharing that case is really just to share. Yeah, but that's a different case. Mark adds that, what about Osik b'mitzvah, Patur min mitzvah? That's true. That's Osik b'mitzvah. That's a concept of klal, but that's because you're already Osik in a mitzvah. But what would happen if you were not Osik in any mitzvah? That's Kiddush Levana. You're not doing something. You just now have a chance to do it now. You can do it later. Later is the better time. Now is that it's in your face. It's in your hand. You have the ability to do it. Sure. The formula of Osik b'mitzvah, Patur min mitzvah is because mitzvah is tzrichas kavana. We have an obligation to have the requisite amount of concentration in a mitzvah, and if it's not possible for a person to do it's efshar l'kayim shneim, it's not possible for a person to do both. So if you're osik in a mitzvah, be all in, buy in, load up in all of your energies and your kavanah and fortitude to be able to do the mitzvah that you're doing. So it's osik b'mitzvah, you're patur min mitzvah. But otherwise, we really don't have in a situation. Yeah, thank you. What did I say? Mitzvah say Shas my grandma, but that's also another patur. It's a patur because of the Gemara's circumstance of being osek in another thing. Meaning, what's the reason why? What is the reason why? Mitzvah say Shas my grandma, women are patur. Not just an idea. The reason the Gemara says because they're osek in other inyanim, and that would be, according to some, they classify that as osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. They're torrid in other inyanim and other things with regards to tzarchei habayis, so that's called osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. But they're good concepts. It's true. You're bringing to the forefront, shedding some light to the idea that there are situations where you push something off, but it has to be circumstantial. I'm talking about where you don't have any circumstances, no reason, no rhyme, no reason, and you push something off. The reason in the case with regards to Kiddush Levana is you would argue that because of the response of the Radbaz should mean that you should not wait. You should jump with alacrity to say the mitzvah, the Kiddush, the sanctification of the moon, Kiddush Levana, now, tonight, Tuesday, Wednesday night, Thursday night, before Shabbos, because what happens if Motzei Shabbos, it's rainy, it's cloudy, I'm not able to say it. That people have missed Kiddush Levana because of that. So what would you say? Some people say that even though the Trumas Hadeshin Paskins La Halacha, that we wait till Motzei Shabbos. Okay, there's some people that choose, they want to do it beforehand. But normative formal halacha is that we wait till Motzei Shabbos, because again, this is, even though the normal system is not to wait, we wait in this situation. So it's just interesting, and I'm just setting this up just to go through this case to really understand and explore when there's a circumstance, when there's another idea that is brought to the table, whether it's Osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah, that's toward the machshava, person is patur because of mitzvah saseh has man grama. There's a litany of different reasons why there could be something that could be one concept over another. And that brings us to our case. And I know, Mark, you and I have studied a little bit of this case together, but it's worthy of just going through it because I think that part of what's fascinating about this case is it's in the clinic, as they say. It's in the clinic. There's the theory, and there's the classroom, and then there's the clinic. And the classroom is what we've been discussing. And now here's the clinic. Here's a case where you have this conundrum. You have two circumstances that are before you, and you have to figure out which one has preference. What's the case? Everybody has the source here. You see, this is from Orach Chaim Aleph, right? Okay, good. So I'm just going to read through the Hebrew and translate along the way. So he says the following. This is the case of Siman Aleph in Orach Chaim, taken from the Shulchan Aruch. B'machanos hamoves b'Germania, in the concentration camps in Germany, Shah Rav Chassid Rabbi Yaakov Levi Bitzrif. I don't know who that is, but there was a certain chassid, and this was his name. Anybody related to him? Because that would be kind of cool. No? As of now, not. Okay. Shishimish ba'avar b'foil litza shtichim. Now, what does that mean? He was working in a factory, and he was working, what kind of factory? With shtichim is in carpet. He was working in a tiach. He was working in a carpet factory. So what happens? V'hine be'echad hayomim. One of the days when he was working in this concentration camp in a factory producing carpets, sehine be'echad hayomim matza b'shetach amifal chavilas tzemer rechelim. What's tzemer rechelim? He found sheep's wool in a bundle. He found it. So now what happens when you have a chassid, a person, somebody finds sheep wool? The Mametz Rav, with tremendous effort, he takes this sheep's wool And tava b'mesiras nefesh chutim shezoram l'shem mitzvahs tzitzis. He spins it, he weaves it, and he turns it into tzitzis l'shem mitzvahs tzitzis. Now, the reason why that's important also is that when you have somebody who makes, whether it's tzitzis or writes mezuzah or some type of sefer, obviously anything that's stam, sefer Torah, mezuzah, tefillin, has to be l'shem the mitzvah. It has to be for the purpose, expressed intent of that mitzvah. So that's why he explains that this is what happened here. So he says that it was l'shem mitzvahs tzitzis. So natal mageves va'asa b'chor, he took a towel. And he takes this towel and he makes a chor, he makes a hole in the towel, and he makes a hole in this towel in order to be able to place his head, in the towel. And what happens is that now he has a four-cornered garment. That Mistarim kesher es chute atzitzis v'hine zochel beged shel daled kanfos muhudar. And that last word is interesting, muhudar. Now, what he does is he now ties from the bundles of the wool that he found, he's able to tie the tzitzis onto this beged. V'hine, and it turns out now, zochal beged shel daled kanfos muhudar. Certainly, they didn't have tzitzis in the concentration camps, but he was able to figure out a way. Not unlike many of the stories that many of us have heard over the years of how the burn and the yearn to be able to perform a mitzvah. So he was able to figure out how to perform this mitzvah. So he made a mitzvah beged of daled kanfos, and he was able to string tzitzis along this beged. Okay, so what happens now? It's this last word is that we just learned is also very important because it's daled kanfos muhudar. It was muhudar. Now what's muhudar about it? Is what's muhudar about it the fact that it's actually muhudar, or what's muhudar about it is the way it came to be? That's a huge difference because part of what we've been learning is it might be that the circumstances might demand a little bit of a different way of thinking about what gets kadima, which gets preference. So we'll table that. We'll get back to that. Over Zman Rav, there wasn't much time before, in the Jewish quarters, everything gets spread very fast. Over Zman Rav, it was then found out in a short order that in this camp there was a talis katan, there was a pair of tzitzis that was kosher. And ke'elef ish hayu mashkimim kum kidei lischos livvosh as a talis katan. 1,000 people came and they got up earlier. They arose early. They ran towards with alacrity. So mashkimim kum seems to suggest they got up early before the Nazis would come. Kidei lischos livvosh as a talis katan, to be able to put on this beged katan, to be able to put on this pair of tzitzis. 1,000 people. Lischos livvosh as a talis katan. Ulevarech al tzitzis lifnei bayim al roitzchem hanatzim yimach shema v'zichram. In order they should just make a bracha. They're not going to wear the tzitzis all day, obviously, because you can't have 1,000 people wear the same pair of tzitzis. But imagine this pair of tzitzis is able to go on every single person. Everybody can make a bracha on the same pair of tzitzis. In fact, you're able to make al pi halacha a bracha on as many pairs of tzitzis as long as it's not the same pair. So I do that on every Friday afternoon before I change my tzitzis and wear a pair of Shabbos tzitzis. I make a new bracha, Asher Kiddushan v'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu al mitzvahs tzitzis on the Shabbos tzitzis. And actually, I never make during the week a bracha on my tzitzis. I'm sure many people don't. That might sound a little bit crazy. And the reason why I don't is because the Mishnah Berurah passes and commentary on Shulchan Aruch that if you wear a talis gadol, wear a talis, so you make the bracha on the talis, and that covers the tzitzis that you wear. So it's not that I don't make a bracha on the tzitzis, even though I don't. It's just covered through another bracha. Good. So these 1,000 people would come and they'd put on this tzitzis, make a bracha, put on the tzitzis, and that's the case. Now, here's what's interesting. Look at the second paragraph. Yesh l'stapek Adam, this fellow, shezachala linatzal mad toifes. Toifes is the inferno from this fire. This guy survives the war, and he is not sure. He has a suffix. He has a doubt. He's not sure. Sheyesh lo talis katan because he had still this talis. This talis, not only did the guy survive, but the talis survived. This talis, which was made with tremendous effort, survives. So also mageves beluya. What's mageves beluya? That the garment became worn out. Obviously, 1,000 people, how many days in a row, how many years later. So you have this garment that's beluya, that's worn out. The garment is now in this status. V'chutei tzitzis avodas yad. Now, whenever we say the words avodas yad, if you go right now to, it's called eichlers.com, or you want to buy a new pair of tzitzis, they're going to say to you, do you want avodas yad? Or if you want to buy a mezuzah or a tefillin, say for Torah, what's avodas yad? Avodas yad today suggests that it's handmade. Handmade and hand woven is considered a mahadran min a mahadran. That's considered ideal. But in the context of this response, in this case, it's not considered mahudr at all. Avodas yad means it's like an amateur. So not only is the garment worn out, but it wasn't made by somebody who's, sitting all day making tzitzis. He's a Talmud Chacham, he's a muflag, he's a Baki in halacha. He knows this is an amateur. Now, maybe it shouldn't matter. Is it just a function of if it's kosher, or is it a function of how it was done? Now, we all know that when you buy mezuzahs on your house, there's two different types of mezuzahs. You can buy just the kosher. You can buy three mezuzahs, one that's not kosher, one that's kosher, and then that one that's muhudr. Now, usually most people like to buy the muhudr one because, for obvious reasons. So v'chutei tzitzis avodas yad. These tzitzis are on this beged that's worn out, and the tzitzis were woven, were made, were tied, were strapped, were strung by an amateur. Now, this guy has this quandary. He's not sure what's a shaila. He has two choices. He can either wear this beged, which is this heirloom, which survives the war, which was made with mesiras nefesh, or he could go to eichlers.com. He could probably pick up a pair of tzitzis on Amazon, but he could write in tzitzis that are muhuderes, that are enhanced, that are beautified, and it's a beged noah v'chutim noim b'ma yivchar. What should you choose? Now, assuming you have the ability to choose one or the other, which one should you choose? Now, obviously, it's a little bit different than choosing one mitzvah over another mitzvah, but what we have here is a subcategory, is choosing even within the same mitzvah. You have the same mitzvah, but one is this way and one is that way. Now, do they seem to be similar? Are they the same? Maybe they're not the same. And if they aren't the same, meaning is the baseline just that they're kosher, and therefore if it's kosher, it's okay. Muhudr is an enhancement that if you have it, good, and if you don't have it, it's fine. But now you have a choice between two different things which are within the same mitzvah. You're going to do the mitzvah. What's the choice that you have before you? One is either that it was with mesiras nefesh, was it made with great effort, with tremendous circumstances, the trial, the tribulation, the instance for which these came to be, versus something which is like mathematically or clinically or systemically different in its classification, in this category of it's actually muhudr. It was avodas yad, like the way it is today. It was actually spun by somebody and wool. It was crafted by somebody who really knows their trade, knows their craft. So which one is better? Which one should a person choose? Anybody want to weigh in? Mark, I have to pull you out. You can't weigh in just yet, because I know you heard some of this. Anybody want to weigh in? What you would think, or have any comments before we jump into some of this? Again, same mitzvah. It's either one is with mesiras nefesh. Oh, this is like it's worn out. It was made by an amateur. Or some was made by a really prominent person. It was not made with the same mesiras nefesh. It doesn't have the same emotional attachment, but it's on a higher level, whatever that means. You have to choose two. Which one would you choose? And part of this conversation obviously plays into the emotions. Do we say that emotions find resonance in halacha? I feel this way, and because I feel this way, so is there an allowance for there to be a place in Shulchan Aruch, in the addendum or the appendix of this, to be able to opine in this situation? What do you say? Any comments, thoughts, comments, theories, feelings?
I'm going to guess that you would want to go with the one that has an emotional attachment, because more has been put into trying to do that mitzvah, and that maybe you should get points for that.
Okay, good, excellent. So even though it's not that you yourself, so I guess I'll ask it this way, which I think is excellent, is would it make a difference the person who made this, or let's just say it's a grandchild, it's a family heirloom, so you didn't do it, or is it the fact that you didn't do it but it was done to it, and therefore because it was made with that level of scrupulous desire, that makes it on a higher level? Or would there be a difference if it was actually something that you made, and because of your love for that mitzvah, the way it was made should mean that it should be used? What do you think about that, Carol?
Well, that seems a little bit different, only because let's say you made it personally, but let's say you didn't make it perfectly correctly. Then I would have to say that you should go with the one that's in good condition, the one that was made correctly.
Right.
But
So I would say
but
this
the
is the
first
case where
example,
they're
yeah, go
both
ahead.
kosher in this case. This case, they're both kosher. One is
Mhm.
muhudar, one is not muhudar. One is enhanced, one is the best, and one
Right,
is okay. So
right.
if surely if there was one of them that was not kosher, then nobody would ever, wear or use something that wasn't kosher. Question here is this
Okay.
is a little bit even more perplexing because they're both kosher. One has an emotional connection and attachment to it, how it was made. We all have like heirlooms. There's something about it. I know we have like in my family, for example, we have a ring that a great grandparent used to marry a great grandparent. And that ring, so the question is theoretically, what if it wasn't worth a shava pruta? Or with it, which wasn't the measured amount that a person needs to use to, to marry someone. So then it wouldn't be kosher to use. But what if it is worth a shava pruta? But let's say it's just not nice. Somebody just doesn't like it. So if somebody doesn't like it, or it's not on the same level, something that's even on a higher level. So then,
But
what would you choose?
but I don't think a mitzvah should be um, measured by whether it's got value for aesthetics or not.
Right.
So I don't think you should weigh a mitzvah by whether it's aesthetically better or not as aesthetic.
Good.
So
Interesting.
I
Right.
would go with the original.
Oh, okay. So you're saying it shouldn't matter if it's aesthetically enhanced. It's just whatever the original one is. Is that what you're saying?
Right. A mitzvah is a mitzvah, and I don't think you should measure a mitzvah by the quality of the material it's made of.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody want to push back on that?
And I just want to say again, isn't there some kavod that, again, that the piece has and that the family should feel towards the original piece?
So that would depend, I guess, on the family. And I always wonder, I know that a lot of us know the famous halacha about covering the challahs Friday night, right? Everybody knows, so one of the reasons why we cover the challahs Friday night. Why do we cover the challahs Friday night?
Oh yeah, not to embarrass it, kind of
Not to
idea.
embarrass the challah, right? So everybody knows that now there is actually a more technical way of describing that very same thing. Like challahs don't get embarrassed, but let's just go with that for a second. The reason why it seems so silly is because we know that exactly that challahs don't get embarrassed. What we're really trying to say is that there's really a bracha pecking order, and that really the bracha of hamotzi is supposed to go before the bracha of bar priyagof. But because the rabbis instituted that we sanctify the day through a glass of wine, a cup of grape juice, so you have to cover it as if it doesn't exist, as if it's not there. There are feelings, no feelings. Challahs don't have feelings. And when we go with that, we say that really tzitzis have no feelings. So it's the question of, let's just assume you were able to buy it at Sotheby's. You're able to find a way to get this. It's like this. Wow! It's a garment that is symbolic of the Jews. Their huge and burning effort to do the mitzvah tzitzis, and 1,000 people did it. Meaning, I would understand how the person who does it, sure, and that's what we're going to see part of the end of this, is that the person who does it, they are in a different status on a different level versus, let's just say we were able to purchase it or to buy it or to know about, or even if it's in our family, it's okay, you feel connection. So on one hand, it could be argued, Linda's saying that what should the enhancement part of it should be secondary to, if it's kosher, it's kosher. And therefore, if there's an emotional connection to it, an emotional reason to it, so then that should be sufficient, right? On the other hand, the idea of an enhancement to a mitzvah is also very significant to all mitzvahs, the way we do things, right? So the way the tefillin that we'll buy, the Shabbos candles that we light, the Hanukkah candles that we light, right? The concept of that it's mahudar, there is the mezuzahs that you'll buy, there is a difference. Now, if you don't have a situation, for example, of financial hardship, if you have a financial hardship, and therefore the question of whether or not you should buy something that you can't afford, that, of course, nobody says you should do. It should be just kosher. But all things being equal, and we should try to buy something or use something that's enhanced. Why? Because there's an enhancement to it. There's a beautification to it. There's something that's the verse in Chumash is Zekeli Vanve, like we say every single day in the Az Yashir. It's beautified. There's an instance. There's an idea of beautifying a mitzvah. So there's two sides of the coin.
Question, Rabbi. Going back to a case we did a couple of years ago about the sofer who was not Shomer Shabbos,
Right.
and therefore were all of the things that he had written, were they kosher? Now, do you apply the same thing to making the tzitzis? Is there a something put upon it if he wasn't Shomer Shabbos?
It's an excellent question, and fabulous memory. It very, very much plays into this, what could become a very rigorous conversation. Because here, what you have is that it's kosher, right? In this case, we're discussing here that the tzitzis are kosher. They're not considered enhanced, but they're kosher, right? In the case that we learned a few years ago, which you're remembering correctly, is that it could be argued that the actual, the mannerism, the mechanism, the actual skill, the craft was fulfilled, right? If you look at the pair of tzitzis and you didn't know that the person who made them was not a Shomer Shabbos, they look like they're tzitzis that are kosher. But what's interesting there is you have a situation where, which we learned, if a person's not Shomer Shabbos, there's a psul, there's an invalidation that therefore even something that looks kosher invalidates what is even a kosher thing, right? That's what you're asking, it's a good question. It's an excellent question, which means you can have a status of a person that can invalidate even the effectiveness and the totality of what seems to be to the naked eye completely kosher, right? That's what you're asking?
Yes.
It's an excellent question. It's a good observation. There are categories and subcategories here. And so therefore, something being kosher, what we understand from this is very succinctly, is the fact that something is kosher might or might not be enough. Now, usually it is enough. But in the case that we discussed previously is that it might not be enough. And the fact that it wasn't in that case, that was the reason why the guy had to go find the people that he sold it to and this, that, and the other thing, right? You remember the conclusion of that. But you see that whereas usually we like to think that if it's kosher, I can hear my grandma saying, don't be such a frum yakar. Like, if it's kosher, it's kosher. Like, you don't have to be more religious than the Torah. But there are situations that if you have two things before you, one that's best and one that's better than the best, you would choose the better than the best, with the exception being where you just have, for example, a financial situation where you might not be able to pay all your bills because you decided to buy oil instead of candles. So then obviously the rabbis tell you that that's silly. You can't do that, right? So we're set up here for this very rigorous debate. Good
Rabbi,
question.
Rabbi, I have a thought, which is kavana. So if one of the pair of tzitzis allows him to have more kavana when he does the mitzvah. In other words, he sort of says, this is special to me. He thinks about putting them on. He thinks about saying the bracha, not just going through the motions. Does that somehow, because it seems to me that, too many things, you go through the motions, and here you have an opportunity to think about it each time because of the history.
Excellent point. Excellent question. So you're saying the regesh, the feeling, his ragshus, he has a feeling to it. And if he has a feeling towards it, so who cares that it's enhanced in the, right? Too bad that I bought it, right? So that's part of what we're trying to figure out together. And let's put this in another term. I guess I'll throw this question out to you because absolutely, sure. All we want to do in life is to be able to do things and to do things meaningfully, right? So certainly the things that we do on a regular basis, like davening 3 times a day, right? We'll take anything we could possibly get. There's a fellow that he inherited a tallis from, also a similar kind of idea, from a relative of his, and it is worn and tattered and actually yellow. It's actually yellow. He wears it on Rosh Chodesh. And I don't know, if to somebody who did not know the story or know the guy, it looks like he's wearing like an old yucky tallis. And this guy has told me, like you just said, and when he puts that tallis around his body, he feels like a different person. Now, it could be argued that maybe you should put that tallis on every day, or maybe that tallis over time he might lose that feeling. He wants to reserve that feeling for one time a month to feel that he wants to feel.
I don't think it matters. What matters is, does that particular item cause you to experience the mitzvah more deeply and more significantly and with more kavana than the other one does, which is the store-bought?
Right,
And
right.
who's measuring the value of the mitzvah?
Excellent. Also good question. Is there an arbiter for that? Is there an objective definition of that? And if there isn't, then you can have theoretically lots of people doing lots of different things, right? But sure, I think the idea that there's anything that enhances your feeling towards a mitzvah, whatever that mitzvah is, seems to be very, very obvious, seems to be a layup. You should be obviously able to do that. But here's what's interesting. I'm just saying this is a follow-up here, playing devil's advocate in the rigor of this conversation, which is, so I'll ask you this, Sid, why would it be necessary in halacha, maybe, forget about the emotions of it, in halacha to even cover the chalas? Like if it is that there's a reason, whether it's emotional or systemic, for me to do something that changes the system, if the rule is that enhanced mitzvah is the best way to go, right? But there's a situation that presents itself that I feel differently about it for whatever the reason, then it could be argued a few different things. Number one, it could be argued that I shouldn't have an obligation to cover the chalas because it's just, the chalas will be fine. Like ordinarily challah, you make a motzi first, then you make a bar priya gafen. But which I tell you, the obligation is to make bar priya gafen to sanctify the day. So I don't have to cover the chalas because I have a different feeling for Shabbos, right? So that's one.
Why don't we bring the challah in afterwards?
I want to bring the challah in afterwards. Good, excellent. Another option. But here's a third question, really, to this, which is also interesting. Is there a possibility? And I'm not trying to set you up here because I know the answer to this question. But imagine what happens in this situation. You have the shivas haminim, right? The 7 grains from Eretz, 7 food items from Eretz Yisrael. So is there a pecking order to that? The answer is yes. If you have shivas haminim, you want to make a bracha bar priya eitz, and you have a rimon in your hand, and you have an apple, you're about to have a fruit salad. So what bracha? So you make the bracha on the rimon because it's one of the shivas haminim, okay? But here's my question for you. What happens, maybe Ramon's a bad example because everybody likes Ramon, everybody gets excited about Ramonim. What happens if you just like an apple more? Are you allowed to make the bracha on the apple? I'll feel connected more to the mitzvah, to the bracha rather, if I make the bracha on the apple. Is that allowed? Or is the system just there when it's a default that I could care either way, could care less either way, and so therefore, if I could care less either way, then I have to make the bracha on the pomegranate before on the apple. But what happens if I do care? If I do care, it sounds like a small example, but just the Shulchan Aruch example. What do you think about that?
I think you should say it on the apple first. I think that anything that can help you experience the mitzvah in a more meaningful way with more feeling and kavana, that's the one you should do.
Right. Even if it's not even, it's interesting. Shulchan Aruch, I'm just doing one comment, Mark, and then I'll be quiet for another minute. It's interesting. It's not even, the Shulchan Aruch uses a very interesting lashon. It uses an interesting language. The Shulchan Aruch does not use the language of that you'll have more kavanah, even though he used the language hisragshus. Now, you and I will translate hisragshus. He has a regesh, he's a feeling for it. It could be that it's more kavanah, right? I would use that word synonymously. But here's what he says. Shulchan Aruch uses the word chaviv. Chaviv is even adif. It's preferred. If it's preferred to you, it then becomes substantial in its status, even greater than a food item that's mentioned in the Torah as that is praising Eretz Yisrael. Now, is there a flaw in a person for liking an apple more than a rimon? Of course, no one's going to say that. Maybe they would. I don't know. I don't know. The Shulchan Aruch Sid rules like you and says that if it's chaviv to you, now, why is it chaviv to you? If it's chaviv to you, it doesn't even matter that you would have less kavanah. Now, I would think that the thought of the Shulchan Aruch is that probably because it's chaviv to you, you'll have more of his ragshus when you say the bracha. You'll have a regesh when you say the bracha. You might not even know it yourself. But something that's chaviv to you, it's beloved to you, it's tender to you, it's dear to you. So the understanding of Shulchan Aruch is that even though the Torah itself says that there's certain foods that are praising Eretz Yisrael through them, and therefore all things being equal, you could care less about one thing over the other. So then, and only then, do you have a pecking order. But if you don't care, then there's a pecking order. But if you do care, chaviv is adif than even those foods that are mentioned in the Torah. So that means, because of his ragshus, then that means that you can have, because you'll have the kavanah and a bracha, you'll have connection to the mitzvah a little bit differently. There's a precedent to give some type of deferential preference to something that is beloved to you, either because you just like it or because it will make you feel different. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, Rabbi, one of the things that Linda had mentioned is remind me that we had the custom in our house, I think it was more than a custom, but we did not put anything else edible on the table.
Until
Not only during Kiddush, but also during a motzi. In other words, that you if you eat hummus with your challah or whatever, you wouldn't have it on the table. You wouldn't put salads on the table before you made a motzi or while you were making a bracha. And so I think there's more to it. It's not just because the challah will be embarrassed. Of course, challah isn't going to be embarrassed.
Yeah.
But that's
Order
not,
of operations,
that's
it's
not the
brachos.
point. It's making another point. Some people will use the term bizoyon. It's an insult to the challah that you're making a bracha on wine while the challah is in front of you.
Right.
It's not. It's a metaphor. It's not meaning that the challah will be embarrassed. It's not a sentient kind of thing. It's mainly to establish the principle that
there's an order of operations in brachos.
Right.
Right.
In Seder, maybe you'll like charos.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think
Karpas at the beginning, maybe I'll eat some.
I like that idea of not bringing anything to the table first, because it kind of accentuates the focus that you're supposed to have. And I find my kids, they like to load up their plates with whatever things they're going to dip their challah in beforehand. It's like always like they're wrestling the hummus and the various sauces and dips beforehand. I like that idea. Let's bring it in after. Why the whole thing? Now, part of the reason why, Linda, to just your question, why don't we just bring it in, is because we want to teach this lesson. Really, the bread, the challah is the staple food. And when you're setting yourself up, being kovea, the suda, setting yourself to have kiddush at the place of the meal, you have the bread at the table. As if you need to have it there. And part of what we're learning, it's like the first lesson you could teach at the Shabbos table is why are we covering the challahs? It's the first question everybody asks anybody who's never spent a Shabbos Friday night meal at anybody's house, never had a Shabbos meal themselves. They're saying like googly eyes watching everything. But one of the questions invariably that's asked is why are you covering the challahs?
By the way, that applies to, my pet peeve about the Haftarah, you know what I mean? But the other, I had another, it was side issue, but it's pertinent to it also. You mentioned that the Mishnah Berurah says, well, you don't have to make a bracha on your talis katan and your tzitzis, because when you put on your talis, that will make up for it. But aren't you ein ma'avirin ala mitzvah? So you're not going to get the shul and put on your talis. It could be for a half an hour or whatever. Why give up the mitzvah of tzitzis on a talis katan for that time?
Good question. It's not giving up on the mitzvah. If it's shechiach that you're
postponing it, in any case, it's postponing it. Your tzitzis are right there.
It's a mitzvah in progress.
That's right. That's what it is. It's as if it's begun, but it's happening, and it culminates with the greater part of it, which is the mitzvah. Now, the bigger question to that is what happens if, what happens on Tisha B'Av? What happens on Tisha B'Av when you put your towels and tefillin on for most people at the end of the day? So what do you do then? Do you not wear your tzitzis all day? So I personally wear my tzitzis, even if you're going to wear, down mincha gedola. I personally don't take my tzitzis off at night on Tisha B'Av night for that reason.
Or you don't make a bracha to it.
Yeah, you make a bracha. Exactly. That's already in the Piskei Teshuvos is a machlekes haposkim. If you have to wait that long, so should you make a bracha on your tzitzis anyway? That's interesting. So just to avoid suffix, to avoid doubt, I spend Tisha B'Av night, I sleep with my tzitzis on. The next day I probably make a talis bracha, my talis gadol. Dr. Seinfeld.
So I view the mitzvahs as a way of effectuating change. And if that's the case, then the mitzvah that you have a much more personal attachment to because of the way it was made. And so if you look at, a tallis that's, machine made or, versus one that, survived the concentration camp, you have an emotional attachment to the one that survived the concentration camp. To me, it's the same as if I can go to a museum and I can see a beautiful painting by Van Gogh and I can say, wow, I mean, it just knocks your socks off and it's a wonderful painting, but I'm very detached from that. I mean, once I leave the museum, I don't have any emotional attachment to that. But if I get a picture from one of my grandchildren, Saba, and, has a house and the parents, etc., that goes on the refrigerator. And every day I look at that and then I say, gee, maybe I should call my grandchild and see how he's doing. That resonates with me much more than the beautiful paint. I know my kids have no artistic ability. It's a given. So I think any mitzvah that can get you emotionally attached to it has sort of a higher value to it, even though on a halachic level, they may be equal.
Right. That's an interesting concept though, no? Isn't that an interesting concept? I mean,
Yeah.
I first, I totally agree with you. What we understand here is that there's two types of gifts that you can get. What the gift is or who the gift is from, right? So if you got a gift of a pen, for example, you might not think that the pen is all that valuable. But if the gift of a pen came from your grandchild or from the president of the United States, you'd feel like, wow, this is a very valuable pen, right? So it depends on who it is. So that's why we say when Hashem gave us the Torah on Shavuos, we're excited because it's not only intrinsically valuable, but it's valuable because Hashem gave it to us. That's why we have both. But it's an interesting idea. That means that if it's something that's meaningful to you, that even though halacha would accord this statistic regulation of it, it should really follow this pattern. You're allowed to eclipse that because it has an emotional connection to you. Now, that's special and extraordinary in this case. Are there dangers associated with that? Are there floaters that now come as a result of that? Are there emotional things that can become, now, as we say, bracha b'lidai, it could be like emotional attachment to things without end. We could probably go into a huge discourse of people that get into things because of the emotional attachment to it, and they could argue vociferously that I feel a greater sense of connection and attachment to that. And maybe it's okay. There's something called Shivim Panim LaTorah. I'm certainly not going to be the judge of that, but we are all the judge of that internally, and certainly personally. We wonder, like, I might feel that I'm going to daven Shachris Rebbe time. Well, if you go to the Chassidim, they daven Shachris Mincha Ma'av Rebbe time. I went once to the Chassidish Rebbe for a Shabbos. So I told the Gibber was looking at my wristwatch, and when I got there for Shabbos, so I said, I was like uncomfortable. So I said, are you looking at my watch? He says, yeah. I said, do you want to borrow it? Do you want to use it? So he says, no, you don't need it. What do you mean? He says, you're on the Rebbe's time. You don't need to look at your watch once. Right then and there, I'm like, oh goodness gracious, so like they daven mincha, like it was like an hour and a half after Shkia. I was like, what in the world is happening here? Like, can we crack open? Is there a Mishnah Brewer in the house here? Can we like crack open some basic Shulchan Aruch? Like, Yaakov, Gibber, calm down. There's such a little peewee here, a little like. So okay. Meanwhile, I davened every one of my tefillas b'yechidus, which is okay. It's okay. Like maybe that was my instructions. The intersect of like what we do and what we feel is sometimes when they're aligned, but sometimes when they're not aligned. So this is a very emotional case because we would all, myself included, actually, that's the halacha. Halacha allows us to favor Mesiras Nefesh versus an enhancement. Interesting. But there's another side of the story. And the other side of the story is that not so fast. And the not so fast would be the distinction between the person to whom it happened, to whom they made it, versus somebody else. Now, maybe there's a difference between his tzitzis, he made it, he survived the war, he survived with that pair of tzitzis, or maybe his great-grandchildren now have that tzitzis. Those tzitzis are a way to connect to the family, or you buy it, you bought it at an auction. My closest child best friend is in the art business, and he is constantly like, sharing with me. He finds at this gallery, he finds at that gallery. He just found something from some, hundreds of years old, pair of tefillin that must have survived, and was that, and do we want to buy it? Who would want to buy such? It's an heirloom. It's extraordinary. It's unbelievable. We have in the family a hat of Rabbi Akiva Eger, the great Rabbi Akiva Eger. The family on one side is related to the Eger family. So we have the hat, there's the pictures. I don't know what's the picture or the painting. The picture of Rabbi Akiva Eger wore a hat. We have the hat in the family. So the hat, what anybody would do to wear that hat. So do we have the right to do that? Is that something that Sid's arguing that if I have that regesh by feeling that connection, then I should be able to do anything. But are there limits to that? Are there boundaries to that? For civilized, righteous, regular people that are living within the boundaries of halacha mostly, so it seems like there's some oozing out abilities that's allowed. But when not, what if you feel? Again, I'm not saying this is necessarily wrong, but what happens if you light Hanukkah candles with candles? Just because you remember as a kid, you lit with candles. I don't know. I'm just being honest with you. When I was a kid, we lit with candles. We didn't light with oil. We just didn't. Sorry to say that on a public broadcast. We did not. We do. I do now, but I didn't. And every time my children light with candles, it just reminds me of my childhood. It's a very special, all the candles and all that. Now there's a difference though between candles that might or might not last long. You try to get the candles to last long. Is there a difference between doing the mitzvah and not doing the mitzvah? It seems to be that the answer to that question is yes. Or is it just doing the mitzvah? Does it matter that it's an enhancement? Do I do the oil because it's beautiful? What if the oil, I don't know, I find the oil to be very messy sometimes, very slimy, very, very yucky, but it's beautifying the mitzvah. So what do you choose? What do you do? So that's this case here. The case here is which one has precedence, which one has kadima. So now we have the case. We have a lot of different thoughts. We have a lot of different avenues here. We're near the top of the hour, so I'm not going to keep you past as much as I have this burning desire to do so. We have the case. We have some thoughts to set the table. And maybe we'll do is next week, we'll pick up from the sources in the Gemara and in the halachic literature to understand where do we find the precedent to see which one is which. We're going to just give you one thought. There's a famous Gemara. The Gemara talks about the Share Nikanor, the gates that are the doors that were used for the gate in the Beis HaMikdash. That's number one. And number two is the Bikurim. The Bikurim that were brought to the temple, the Kohanim who would accept the Bikurim. So there was a difference between how the Kohanim accepted the Bikurim of the wealthy versus how they accepted the Bikurim of the Aniyim, of the poor. Now that seems to be an injustice. Why should you accept them all the same? Now they did accept the baskets, what was in the contents of those baskets, but we're talking about the actual baskets themselves. We'll talk about that in Hashem next time. So to keep it in a chaticha haroilis chabed, a nice sound bite, a nice piece. Any last thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Doc.
Just a clarification. In the first sentence of the Simon Aleph, Srif, it means a bunk or a barracks. So it's not part of the rabbi's name.
Oh, very good. But so I didn't know that.
But Srif Shishkimesh Ba'avar Mifal. So in other words, the rabbi was in a barracks that was previously used as a factory to manufacture rugs.
Wow. Okay, good. So that's a barrack bunk.
But yeah, in sleepaway camp, Srif was your bunk.
Aha. You must have gone to, what camp did you go to?
Mossad. Hebrew speak.
So they say that you're tzrif bet tzrif gimel?
Correct.
Yeah, Robert, just for
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's good.
David is as old as I am, I think.
What is that?
I remember when I first went to Israel in Keren B'Avne and so on, the dorms were in what we called the tzrifim.
Right.
The sheds, so to speak, I
gotta write that down. I did not know that word.
It sounds quite fancy.
It's
not.
It's not. No, typically in Israel, tzrifim are considered the sheds. The little,
yeah.
Not to be confused with the trisim. Not the trisim and the tzrifim.
Right. Trisim are curtains.
Curtains.
Shades, blinds.
The shades, yeah.
So,
Mhm.
but Snif Shishimish Ba'avar, got it. Before the, okay, got it. Very good. So he was in this bunk that was once used for that, and that's where he finds it.
Well, I would
Right.
call it a shed, where the
Okay.
factory was.
I'll let the two of you guys duke that out.
Clearly not a glamorous place.
Right, exactly.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you,
wonderful
Rabbi.
day. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank
your
you.
questions.
Have a great
Thanks.
day.
All
You
right,
too.
bye-bye.
Be well, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.